we've talked quite a bit about ports and some of the security that's involved in ports and how they create sockets, how it addresses certain services that are running on a server. So we talked a lot about ports. Let's talk about some of the common port associations. So it's really important for you to understand these port associations. Usually when you're on the job, you can go and look things up, but it is inefficient if you have to constantly look up these different port associations. So it's really my recommendation is to get a solid grasp of at least the common ports that are associated with certain services. And you can go away from that when you're setting up a service. You can move away from that. And we talked about the security ramifications of that already. But it's really, for the most part, you better have a good reason if you're not going to use what's already set up out there. So let's talk about these common port associations. And it would be my recommendation, especially if you're going after certifications and even for you to be successful in the job to a certain degree, is to understand at least the basics of certain ports that are associated with certain services. So just a reminder about port number groups. Lots of different ones out there. There's this first range right here, which are well-known ports. Those are the ports that you probably don't want to move away from that are associated with certain services. There are some outside of this range that you probably don't want to move away from as well. But these well-known ports, they have a pretty big establishment between these ports and these different services. And then you have registered ports. Registered ports are where a business wants to utilize a certain port, and so they'll register that port, and then that way that you can commonly associate those ports with some sort of service. And then there's the more dynamic, private, or ephemeral ports that your computer will assign automatically, or will utilize some of these dynamic, private, or ephemeral ports. They're just kind of designed to be a little more free and use readily out there. So a good example of this would be is a Minecraft port, which I'm very familiar with because I've set up several Minecraft servers. It is not a registered port, but it's generally associated with 25565, at least when it comes to a world server on Minecraft. It uses this 25565 and it's associated with that service. But when I want to host multiple worlds out there, I'll actually use 25565. Maybe I use 66, maybe I'll use 67. So I'll use the sequencing depending on how many worlds that I want to generate. So that way, when a machine connects into it, it knows which world it's going to access. And it knows it by these port numbers and what port I set up on these different worlds. And then I've also used something that's completely out of the sequence, maybe like 26415, just to come up with a random number. I'll use this sequence, and then it kind of puts it out of the range of the rest of it, with the idea is maybe I'll have less people trying to access this Minecraft server if it's off a little bit, if it's not on the same standard sequence that everybody else is using. So it's, once again, they're not ports that are registered that are out there, but you can utilize some of these ports and not use the non-standard ports. But for the most part, especially in this first range right here, you want to use the standard ports most of the time, unless you have a good reason not to use it. Now, as we go through this list, another thing to understand is that there are some protocols that use multiple ports. So an example would be like FTP. FTP has a connection that it establishes between a client and a server. You have a FTP client and you have a FTP server. It will establish some sort of communication and set up the rules or the discussion part of this, where it says, okay, this is what I need to do, this is how I want to do it, blah, 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 so forth. But then when it actually gets to the data transfer, it will use a different port. And so you just have to know that there are some of these protocols that will set up the control or the communicating of commands on one port, but then the actual data transfer will happen on another port. And they could, you could have multiple ports that are opened up just for one service. Similarly, you could have protocols that just use one port, but some of the data that's transferred would be TCP, and other data would be UDP traffic. So you could have a scenario where it's utilizing one port, but it has both TCP and UDP traffic, or possibly it has two different ports, and one of it is for the TCP traffic, and some of it's for the UDP traffic. So you could see protocols that have both, that utilize both TCP transfer and UDP transfer, and probably is likely the case in some of these protocols. All right, so let's talk about some of these well-known ports. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about ports and what ports are well-known. We'll talk about whether they're TCP or UDP, and then we'll mention the protocol that's associated with those ports. So there's a few different things that we're going to cover. This is not supposed to be a really exhaustive list of everything. This is supposed to be just the highlights of the ones that are most important, whether you're studying for a certification exam or just in your career as you run across access control lists or you run across packets that are going across your network. This will help you quickly identify what that traffic is associated with. One thing I will note with all of this is that I've broken this down into different components through here. So there's different slides here. This one is the slide for file transfer and console protocols. Don't think that there's something magical about these categories here. These are just categories. I chose to break these to present this data in this format. So don't think that you're going to go out there and find these different categories out there. This is just what I came up with to break this data down into a little bit more sizable chunks here. So let's talk about file transfer and console. So first of all, console, to get into equipment, to remotely connect into equipment and issue commands into that equipment. Maybe you're going and configuring that equipment. So we want to get onto a piece of equipment. There are a couple ways of doing that. So one is Telnet. So Telnet uses port 23. It's TCP, so it's reliable, and it uses Telnet to connect into a device. And essentially what you're doing is when you console into a device using Telnet, whenever you hit a command on your keyboard, it sends it, just like a terminal would, sends it to that device processes it, and then replies back with essentially what it is that you have typed, issues a command back to that terminal or to whatever you're using to access that. So if I type an A, it sends the A, brings it back and sends, you typed an A, put that up on your screen. And then you will continue to do that. You hit enter to execute a command, and then it will display the results of that command on your console. So Telnet is a way to do that, and it doesn't transmit things securely. So Telnet is considered insecure, but it is a way to get onto equipment and manipulate it and change it and configure it and do all that fun stuff. Now, similarly, if you want to, and you should, be secure about it, you would use port 22 or secure shell. So secure shell is a way to securely get onto a device and be able to enter those commands without other people being able to capture that data and being able to access that data later because they're capturing the information that you're sending over to that. So when possible, use port 22 on those devices. Then let's get into some file transfer. The first one I have on here is a very common protocol, FTP. FTP uses port 20 and 21. Port 21 is the connection side of this and creates connections into it, versus 20 actually then does the data transfer back and forth. So it's FTP, or file transfer protocol. Once again, it's a very common protocol, and we use these things to like upload files or download files, or a lot of times I've used it when I'm creating websites and I need to get the data up into the cloud. And I've used it for client data transfers back and forth. So that's FTP. Now there are secure ways of doing FTP. FTP is not considered as secure as other methods of encrypting that data and transferring that data back and forth. So one example of that is the SFTP. So SFTP is Secure File Transfer Protocol. This is not to be confused with FTPS. In fact, actually, SFTP is not, as I have not seen it as, not that it's not utilized quite a bit out there. I have not seen it really widely used out there. I've seen more FTPS used. So SFTP, the reason why it's the same port as SSH is it uses SSH to secure the transfer. So SFTP uses SSH to encrypt that traffic and secure that traffic that's going back and forth. So that's why it utilizes the same port number. All right, then we have trivial file transfer protocol, not considered a secure method of transferring files, but the key to this one, it's port 69, it uses UDP, it's called TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol, and it uses, the advantage of TFTP is it's a UDP. So if you have some sort of device, maybe it's transferring some log files and it needs just a place to dump log files as it comes in, and it's not going to be devastating if it loses a couple files along the way, it's just inputting data into the system, then that would be a case for TFTP and to get that file being transferred from one location to another. Then we have SFTP or FTPS. FTPS is FTP over SSL, although with a lot of these technologies, we no longer use SSL. So a lot of times it's incorporated into the name of these, but we actually technically don't use SSL and we use TLS instead. But for whatever the point, we've kept it as SSL, so FTP over SSL. The SSL part of it is what secures it. This is port 989 and 990. It uses TCP. And once again, that's FTPS or FTP over SSL. Then we have SMB or server message block. Server message block actually can do quite a few different things. I've chosen to put it in this file transfer area, but it can do quite a few more things than just file transfers. But SMB is commonly associated with Windows, and it's server message block. It's what we use to transfer files using Windows systems. And you probably have used SMB before in the past if you worked at with network drives and you transferred files back and forth between computers. That could be a good chance that you've used this before and just not realized that you've used SMB. So there are some examples of file transfers and consoles that different protocols are out there and the port numbers that are associated with those protocols. Okay, next we're going to talk about email protocols and some protocols that are associated with email. So first thing you need to understand, and I constantly push on the places that I work, is that email is not considered a secure form of transferring data. And that is, you could have a secure connection from your server to other email servers, but then once it's past that, somewhere out there, it could be insecure communication. And that is because for the longest time, we were using port 25, which is Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It's an unsecure method of transferring emails, and it's still used to this day. So port 25 is associated, it's a TCP port. It's associated with SMTP, still used quite a bit out there. We try to encourage servers, so servers are encouraged to make a connection in a more secure manner. But if it's connecting to the other side and the choice is don't send this or I have to send it insecurely, a lot of servers are set up to, well, I'm still going to send this. I'm still going to get this email to its final destination, even though I got to go over this insecure connection. So that's port 25. Once again, we try not to use just simple mail transfer protocol by itself without insecure anymore. But sometimes you just don't have a choice. That is really to send emails. It's a protocol of sending emails. So it could be your client that's on your machine that's sending it to the server. It could be a server to server, just relaying that information. So that's to send mail. Versus POP3 has been used for a long time also. Consider it unsecure, 110. POP3 version, or POP3 Post Office Protocol version 3. is 110. It's port 110, and it uses TCP to be able to grab data and pull it down, and it's usually to the client. So it's taking it from the email server and pulling it down to the client. So what I'm saying is, like, Outlook would be an example of this, or there are different clients that are set up on your machine that will download those emails onto your machine. That's different than, like, a lot of people will access email through, like, if you're accessing Gmail, then you're probably using a web browser to access it. That wouldn't be the same. That's not the type of client that we're talking about here. This is a client that is a separate program that's on your machine. It's going and connecting to your mail server and dragging it down to the local computer, a copy onto your local computer. And Post Office Protocol version 3 is what does that. IMAP, or Internet Message Access Protocol, is very similar, except for it's a more dynamic connection between the two. So POP version 3 has the ability to download those emails onto your computer, and there is a checkbox to say, hey, keep a copy still up on the server. I still want to keep a copy on there. I just want a copy on the local one. But POP 3 is not really considered very dynamic, versus an IMAP connection gives you a lot more functionality, and it creates a much more dynamic conversation between what's on the server and what's on the local client. So that way, when you update one, then it will update the other, and it's a much more dynamic connection when you're using IMAP. But that is found on port 143. It's a TCP connection, and that's the Internet Message Access Protocol. Then we get back to versions of SNMP. So we have 587, which is TCP. It's SMTP over TLS. So here again, I mentioned before, we no longer really use SSL like we used to because it's not really considered secure. It's certainly not as secure as TLS is, so we've switched over to TLS. But this is just a method of using SMTP, but in a secure manner. And then same thing with a secure for IMAP over SSL, and it's TCP, port 993. And then finally, we've got POP3 over SSL, which is 995. It operates on both TCP and UDP, and that's POP3 over SSL. Okay, let's talk about some directory services here. Directory service in its true form is things like when you're logging into your computer, it will use directory services to look up your name and your password and make sure that you are authorized to log on to a machine. So that's directory services. And then I threw a couple other services on top of this because they're commonly associated with each other. So an example, if I roll out a Windows Active Directory machine, then I'm also rolling out probably a DNS server on that same machine, DHCP. It has some sort of network time protocol. So these are some of the services that are associated with that. Can I roll it out on a different service, or maybe a different server, or maybe a different piece of equipment like a layer 3 switch or a router? I can absolutely do that. So you'll find these on other locations as well. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to lump it up into directory services because often that's how I actually choose to implement it. So first up here, we've got port 53, which operates on both TCP and UDP. That is DNS, or domain name system. Domain name system is what allows us to not have to use IP addresses for everything we contact. So I don't have to type in the IP address to Google to use Google. All I'd have to do is type in www.google.com to access that. And the way it translates that, because we know that that's not addressable on the internet in itself, is it has to translate that to an IP address. This is the system that does that. DNS is the system that translates domain names into IP addresses so you can access those services. All right, then we have DHCP, or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It operates on port 67 and 68. It's a UDP. DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and what happens with DHCP is it dynamically establishes an IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, DNS, and several other options. There's a lot into DHCP, a lot of cool stuff in DHCP of how you can access different services using DHCP. So that is a method to access this. Really, this is one of the first protocols because your computer starts up, and for it to communicate to the outside world, it really needs to get some information, and it usually does that through DHCP. Okay, then we have 123, or NTP, the Network Time Protocol. That's UDP. UDP is a way to sync clocks. Now, what happens is if your clock is not synchronized, it can cause problems, especially with things when you're using Active Directory and Kerberos and your machine gets off from the rest of the network. It can cause problems. It also can possibly cause some problems when you're out there on the internet and you're scrolling around on the internet, and it can cause problems there too. So, and generally speaking, we just want our machines to have the proper time. And so Network Time Protocol allows it to do that. It allows your machine to go out and get the time and synchronize its clock with some sort of master clock. And so that way it has an up-to-date time. All right, then we have LDAP and LDAP-S. Lightweight Directory Access Protocol and Lightweight Directory Access Protocol over SSL. So we see that it uses both TCP and UDP for both those, and 389 and 636. So LDAP is our directory services. This is once again when you type in your username and password and can log into that machine, when you're on a network, then what it's going and doing is going and verifying who you are to make sure that it is who you say you are and you've got the proper credentials to get onto that machine. So this is associated with business, or it wouldn't be like your home. It's not the same as when you're logging on your just local machine. If it's a home PC or something, it would be more like a business and you're VPN'd in, or when you're sitting there in the office and you log into a machine and it just goes and checks to verify, does this person have access to this machine? Should I be allowing them to access this machine? So that's directory services, and LDAP is used in most of your networks once it gets past a certain size. All right, then we have the web, and hopefully if you've been following along with is that you already have a good understanding of port 80 and port 443, which has to do with HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The S at the end just means secure. Once again, at one point in time this was SSL. It now uses TLS to secure that traffic. I did sneak this other one in here, port 179, which is TCP. It's Border Gateway Protocol. You'll have to know that if you're going for your Cisco certification. But BGP is a way for it's a dynamic routing protocol and a way for communication to establish with that. So I kind of snuck it into this web, even though I don't know if it's completely fitting in this category. But that's the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, port 179. All right, let's talk about management protocols, or what I'm loosely grouping up into management protocols. In fact, like NetBIOS, I could also see that kind of fitting into the directory services, but I put it here for now. This is port 137, 138, and 139. It uses both TCP and UDP. NetBIOS is not necessarily a protocol in itself, but there are some other mechanisms within there. Essentially what NetBIOS does is allows Microsoft machines to communicate and connect with each other. So that's NetBIOS. It's one of the protocols. I believe they've been trying to get rid of it for a while now, and it just keeps sticking around. They keep finding uses for it. So we haven't completely gotten away from it. It certainly is not as prevalent as it used to be. Then we have SNMP, and this is a simple network management protocol. So it operates on port 161 and 162. It uses UDP. And once again, it's SNMP. And this is a way to make connection into devices to get information from these devices and to manage these different devices. So a lot of times you'll have a separate application that goes and gets into these devices to manage those devices. And some of that traffic can be, you can use SNMP to get that information and to send that information. Similarly, syslog does something similar as well. It uses port 514. Typically uses UDP, although there's a lot of implementations that use TCP to get that reliability from it. The syslog, there will be some sort of server that you can allow machines to upload to that server and get information into that server. And so what we'll upload is the logs into that server. And there's some really cool programs too that will then be able to do some sort of queries across multiple logs to gather information and see what's happening on your system as a whole. So syslog servers can be pretty cool and be able to collect some information, some log information. And there's different levels in which you can communicate. You can just high alerts or warnings you can communicate into the syslog server, or it could be simple informational stuff that gets uploaded into it. Of course, depending on the level that you say, this is what I want, it can have more or less traffic and kind of clutter things up if you get too much information that's trying to be uploaded into your syslog server. And then the last one on here through remote desktop protocol, which is port 3389 in there. It operates off a TCP. You probably will hear a lot about RDP, and when you RDP into a computer, well, you're remoting into a computer. So similar to SSH into Linux machines, we usually use RDP to get into Windows machines. Some of those lines are being blurred now a little more, but RDP is generally associated with Microsoft Windows, and it uses port 3389. All right, let's wrap up our conversations around common port numbers. Here's a few more. Most of these are associated with databases. Databases is some sort of structured data. So we take information and we dump it into a structured table, or perhaps maybe it's not structured, but we're dumping information into some sort of storage container. So it's a little different than just dumping a raw file into it. We're just dumping text or dumping information into these databases. So I've outlined a few here. One thing that you'll want to know is that SQL, or structured query language, is something that a lot of databases use to operate for you to interface with those databases. But when we see SQL by itself right here, a lot of times when we see that, it's associating with specifically Microsoft SQL. So a lot of databases will use SQL language to communicate with it. So you'll see PostgreSQL, you'll see here I've got SQLnet, MySQL. You'll see different instances of SQL that are put out by many different companies. But when you just see SQL by itself, generally we associate that with Microsoft SQL or Microsoft SQL Server. This is Structured Query Language Server, and it operates off a TCP on port 1433. We have a couple variations of this. SQLnet, which is TCP and UDP, and 1521. We've also got MySQL databases, which is 3306, and operates off of TCP. It's TCP communication. And then we have SIP, which has TCP and UDP within it. It's port 50 and 5060 and 5061, and it's Session Initiation Protocol. So SIP. What we can associate this is with like video conferences or audio, some sort of telephony. So this communication happens on SIP, and it sets up a session, and that's the protocol that it uses for the communication. So that's 5060 and 5061. So once again, these protocols, some of them are more important than others, but it's good to get an understanding, at least an association, so that way when you're looking at access control lists, when you're looking at information, or especially if you're going to be going and taking a certification exam, it's really good to have a basic understanding of these ports and what services that they're associated with. And you'll see it come up, especially quite a few of these will come up on your everyday as you're administering these networks and on your job. When you're on your job, you'll see these ports come up, and it's once again good to have a basic understanding of them. Hope this video is helping you out. Can you help me out by hitting that like button?